Hello, everyone. We're here for our review for the AP exam. This section will be on the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. So let's get started. Obviously, the Roaring Twenties is following World War One, and at the end of World War One, the U.S. did enter a brief recession. There was a time of a little bit of a slowdown in the economy. There's also going to be a rise in nativism as the communist revolution in Russia took place in 1917. It's important to note that there was a first Red Scare with a fear of foreigners targeting both communists, anarchists, and any other radicals here, but I'll get to that later in the slideshow. Economically, in the 1920s, after that initial recession, the decade was very prosperous for most people. It was not prosperous for farmers, but it was for the middle class and, of course, the upper classes. People were buying goods on credit at this time, and these sometimes referred to as installment plans, installment buying, buy now, pay later. There's going to be a rise in advertising during the 1920s. Sears had the first mail order catalog at the time. You're going to also see just brand new consumer products that are hopefully going to try to make people's lives easier. But overall, the 20s is considered a good economic time. Please keep in mind, though, that at this during this decade, the income tax, which had just started with the 16th Amendment, is going to be lowered. I think I'll get to that later in the slideshow as well. Okay, what were some of the new modes of transportation and communication during the 1920s? It's important to note that the Wright brothers, who first succeeded with a plane in, I think, 1903, but the first flight from New York to Paris is going to be during the 1920s with Charles Lindbergh, flying about 26 hours over the Atlantic Ocean, taking off from our very own Roosevelt Field. Henry Ford and the Model T is probably the mode of transportation that is most synonymous with the 1920s. That is a picture of the Model T. What was impressive is the cost. It was very affordable for people. That he used the assembly lines, so many of the models obviously were identical, but his business tactics were also very impressive, which we will get to later on. And telephones and radio will also be more prominent in the 1920s. Next, culturally, how were the 1920s impacted women? Those flappers are going to be challenging traditional society, traditional norms, by dressing in a way that showed their arms, or they were smoking cigarettes in public, dancing with men. This was definitely a radical view of women's behavior at the time. The jazz age, we have jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, who are very prominent during this era. There is a group of writers, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, who are referred to as the lost generation of writers. This is because of their disillusionment with American society. They were very upset with the way American society was developing at this time. In baseball, Babe Ruth was considered an icon. Some of you might have heard of the phrase "the curse of the Bambino." That is because the Boston Red Sox actually traded Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees, and then did not win the World Series until, I believe, 2004, when they came back from a 3-0 deficit to beat the Yankees in the ALCS. Flagpole sitting was a nice little practice that people enjoyed in their leisure time. And the Harlem Renaissance, this here to the side is a picture of the Cotton Club. Harlem Renaissance was a tremendous time of African American culture, and focused largely in New York City. They are going to be focusing on the themes of slavery and racism and discrimination. The poet Langston Hughes is going to be a very prominent member during this time. I didn't mean to do that. Okay. Sorry about that. Just trying to figure out this new program. All right. So the presidents of the 1920s will all be Republicans. Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. All three will support a more limited role of the federal government in the economy. The Secretary of the Treasury during this time, Andrew Mellon, did believe in lower tax cuts. That's a philosophy that you can compare with the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan. We will not talk about Warren G. Harding's extramarital affairs right now, although there's a rumor that she was possibly a spy for the Germans during World War One. And Calvin Coolidge was a man of very few words, but was very much in favor of the rise of big business and believed the chief business of America was business. And of course, we'll get to Herbert Hoover when we get to the Depression. Okay, what was the U.S. foreign policy during the 1920s? U.S. attempted to be isolationist. How isolationist were we is up for you to decide. Two specific acts you could be familiar with. We all know that Germany was punished severely after World War One and had difficulty paying back its war debts, war reparations. So the Dawes Plan was devised by, I believe, a U.S. senator who had American bankers loan money to Germany so that Germany could pay back Britain and France, so that Britain and France could pay back the United States. And that's about the extent of which I understand the Dawes Plan. But one year, maybe I'll figure it out. Kellogg-Briand Pact, however, is one of my favorite acts. This was a pact that eventually 62 nations signed outlawing war. And yes, that would probably be my favorite act. All right, for women during the 1920s, in addition to flappers challenging traditional society, we should be familiar that women achieved two amendments that they fought decades for. The 18th Amendment is prohibition. That will be when alcohol is made illegal. Alcohol is illegal throughout the entire 1920s, from 1919 until 1933. The 19th Amendment is when women finally achieved the right to vote. Hopefully you remember the little story about how this amendment was officially ratified. It takes 3/4 of the states to ratify an amendment. They needed one more state to get to the magic number, which at that time was 36. And Harry Byrne from Tennessee, who was the deciding vote, wherever he voted was going to be the determination of women's suffrage, picked out a little letter in his jacket from his mom, who said to be a good boy and make his mommy proud. And that is why the 19th Amendment was ratified. Also, just feel like talking, Charlotte Woodward is the only lady who was alive at the Seneca Falls Convention way back in 1848 to be able to see the 19th Amendment ratified. Unfortunately, I believe she was too ill to vote that day. I had to put a question mark next to Margaret Sanger simply because of the divisive nature of this issue. Margaret Sanger is responsible for Planned Parenthood, and for some women this is a victory. For others who are against abortion, this would not be considered an achievement. All right. And now let's go to immigration policies during the 1920s. I started talking about this earlier. There was a first Red Scare after World War One. The Attorney General's name was A. Mitchell Palmer, and he was the one responsible for, I think they arrested about 6,000 people and deported 500 of them. It all started, somebody was placing bombs in mailboxes, and this led to a raid on foreigners, radicals, anarchists at the time. Very important, in the 1920s, the U.S. was very restrictive of immigration. So this quota system starts in 1921. It's the National Origins Act. And I'll try to explain this clearly. We would take the census and determine how many people are here from Italy, how many people are here from Greece, how many people are here from Britain. Whatever that number was, we were allowing 3% of that number to come into the country every year from that nation of origin. And 3 years later, we lowered the percentage to 2% of the total. But we also took the census numbers from 1890. So I hope you all know that this would be more restrictive on the new immigrants who are from Southern and Eastern Europe, meaning Poland, Greece, Russia, and Italy. Nativism is the fear of foreigners, and this was definitely prominent in the 1920s, as we will also see a resurgence in the KKK. And then just one little story, the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. These two men were arrested for murder, even though the evidence was incredibly flimsy and really did not indicate that they did the crime. They were convicted and sentenced to death, and in Boston today, they do actually celebrate Sacco and Vanzetti Day in honor of uh, their mistreatment and execution. All right, and now we end the decade with the crash, October 29th, 1929. What happened on this day? Well, first, it's great to know that the buying of things on credit was not limited to consumer goods. Stock market, you were able to buy stocks on margin, is the phrase. And this allowed people to purchase stocks with 10% down. When would you pay the rest of the price? You would pay the rest as soon as the stocks went up. And how would you know that they were going to go up? Basically, the entire decade of the 1920s witnessed an increase in the stock market. Well, sometime around September, maybe early October, rumors started to circulate that maybe the stocks might not last, and people started to sell. As people sell stocks, the prices go down. On October 24th, it was a very bad day. That was a Thursday, and the stocks plummeted pretty roughly. On the Friday, October 25th, Wall Street bankers, a group of them, decided to purchase stocks simply to keep it at bay. Saturday and Sunday, the stock market is closed, but on Monday, selling continued. And then on October 29th, Tuesday, known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. Stocks that were worth $100 a share were now worth 2 cents. So now how does that lead to the depression? Because there are some people that think that this is not the primary cause of the depression. But you still owe the money to your stockbrokers. So if you owe them money, now you have to figure out ways to pay them. Okay, so let's consider that we were smart and we didn't put all our money in the stock market. We kept some money in the banks. So now we go to the bank to take out our deposits, and the bank tells us the money is not there. And that is because banks loan money to people and did not have those people paying those loans back. So the money was gone and it was never coming back. So now we still have to figure out ways to pay off our stockbrokers. So we will sell those wonderful items that we bought for our family. We may even have to sell our house and car. Clearly, we will not be buying much of anything lately. And if people do not buy goods, that leads to less sales from the businesses. Businesses then have to lay off workers. If businesses lay off workers, then those people can't buy goods. It's a vicious cycle that led to initially about 25% of the country without a job, and it went up to about 33% at the worst time of the Depression. There were some cities where it was 50%. All right. These are considered the various causes of the Great Depression. Some people think, in addition to the stock market crash, it might be the overproduction of goods, which leads to lower prices. Some people might think that it is the decline of the farm economy. Some people view the uneven distribution of income that was existent at the time. All the purchasing of goods on credit is sometimes targeted. The debts from the war, there was really not enough buying and selling from one country to another. And then some people do blame the government for not doing enough. Okay, so who was president at this time? His name was Herbert Hoover. And who was Herbert Hoover? Herbert Hoover was the first self-made millionaire to become president. He actually only took $1 as salary, same thing as Donald Trump is doing, I believe. And his basic philosophy at first was be patient. The economy has highs, the economy has lows. Eventually, the economy will fix itself. While you're being patient, work hard, rugged individualism. If you have to get 2 jobs, get 2 jobs. And if you do happen to be fortunate enough to have money, then make some donations to your local charities. He really did not want the federal government getting involved in this crisis. And then, of course, I put in big capital, and that is a more conservative, laissez-faire approach. But I always make this point very clearly. The economy did not improve. So the second half of Hoover's presidency, he did change his views somewhat. So to say that he was completely conservative, I don't believe is accurate. First action he took was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This is when he loaned $2 billion to banks, to railroad companies, to insurance companies, hoping to spark some economic development. This is exactly what President Bush and then President Obama did during the 2007 recession. It was called the bailout back then. So again, to say that Hoover did nothing, I just think is unfair. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was his decision to increase the tariff to the highest rate ever. That backfired tremendously on him. Um, he lost. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. I really should not have my phone next to me when I'm doing this. Let's start that over. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was the highest tariff rate in American history, and what it did, the intent was that it would bring in more revenue because these are taxes on foreign goods sold to the United States. However, what it actually did is prevented goods from being sold from one country to another. Other countries raised their tariffs, and it turned out to be an economic disaster. On a personal note, the bonus march did not work out anywhere in Hoover's favor. This is when World War I veterans decided that they would like their bonus payments, which were promised to them in 1945 for their service and dedication to the country. They asked if they could have those bonus payments now. The only part of the government that could do that would be Congress, but Congress voted no. So then they decided to march to Washington, D.C. to protest. Hoover, obviously not wanting any disruption in Washington, D.C., even offered to pay for their train tickets home if they would stop protesting, but they refused. And what happens is our own military is going to use tear gas on our veterans, and it is a public relations nightmare for Herbert Hoover. People call the boxes that they're living in Hoovervilles. Newspapers are called Hoover blankets, empty pockets, Hoover flags. At this point, even though Hoover was renominated for the Republican presidential candidacy, he had no chance of winning. And FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, comes in with a tremendously different philosophy on how the government should run. So, initially for FDR, in his inaugural address, he says the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he is trying very hard to get Americans to understand that we're going to get through this, and he doesn't want people to be concerned and overly worried. He spoke to the people through his fireside chats over the radio, sitting in front of the fireplace, surrounded himself with the smartest people he could find, economically, the brain trust, and I put one man's name, John Maynard Keynes, who is a very liberal economic thinker, who believes that even in a depression, it is better to spend money to stimulate economic growth. Your debt will go up, but in the long run, it will pay off. That's a very liberal view, counter to the conservative economic thinker later, Milton Friedman. I think the first major step that FDR takes is called the bank holiday. And what he did is he closed down every bank in the country. This is because so many people were afraid of putting the money into the banks. People were putting them in their mattresses, digging holes in their backyards. So once the bank holiday starts, then as banks were sound financially, they would reopen. And this would give people the confidence that if the government believes they're safe to open, of course, it should be it should be safe for them to put their money in the bank. And then the act that I've spent numerous hours teaching. I actually put it in my 25-page paper this weekend. Don't ask me how I fit it in, but I did. The Glass-Steagall Act. This act separated banks from investment firms. So because so many people were engaging in risky behavior during the early stages of the Great Depression, FDR and his advisors believed that we should, if it's a bank, that should be a safer investment. And if it's an investment firm and they want to take on riskier behavior, they can do so. But you can't combine the two. And sometimes people say the phrase too big to fail, that they don't want these banks to become too big, that they set off an economic recession. The Glass-Steagall Act was in place from 1933 until 1999 when Bill Clinton repealed it. And please remember, it was North Dakota Senator Byron Dorgan who said at that time that we would live to regret this in 10 years, and he was off by 1 year. And then Frances Perkins, just first female cabinet member. She was the Secretary of Labor for FDR. Okay, so FDR's approach to solving the depression is called the New Deal, and there's many acts. A lot of times they're called the alphabet agencies. I put one in there that is not a New Deal program because I just forgot to put it on the other slide, and that's the 21st Amendment. They did repeal prohibition at this time, and some people think it was because it was too difficult to enforce making alcohol illegal. Other people thought it was an economic decision to raise more revenue. So these are just some of the programs that I decided to highlight. FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Now, people's individual bank accounts were insured up to $5,000. That amount has increased over time, and I believe today it is about 250,000, although I don't have to worry because I'm not close to that number. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a program for young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, maybe 17, 16 as well, who would be sent off into the Midwest to work on environmental projects, could be cutting down trees, raking leaves, building parks. And the men were housed by the government, fed by the government, and were given $30 a month, of which $25 needed to be sent back to their families. Sorry, that was my dog barking. Okay, a farming project called the Agricultural Adjustment Act was a plan where they actually paid farmers to not grow crops and paid farmers to slaughter pigs. Why would we do this at a time where people were hungry? Economically, they believed that it would increase the prices for farmers and improve their economic lot. Don't really ask me about that one either. However, the Supreme Court would later rule that this was unconstitutional. Tennessee Valley Authority. This is an interesting one. There were people in the southern part of the country who were so poor that they could not afford electricity at the time. So they decided to build a federally sponsored hydroelectric dam. So, of course, this number one creates jobs, which is always a key part of the New Deal. But in addition, it provides cheap water power for the people in the 8 state region. Why would this be criticized, you might ask? Because the private companies would then see the federal government as too much competition and people might all change over their policies to the government program. So many people referred to this as creeping socialism. The Works Progress Administration was an attempt to create jobs again, building schools, bridges, roads, hospitals. Social Security is always your go to act. Elderly people who lost everything really had no savings to fall back on. So, to prevent that from ever happening again, we created a government program where people are taxed while they're working, and then when they reach 62, 63, it depends on when you want to collect, you can start to get money back from the government. And the Wagner Act was a pro labor union act that gave labor unions the right to bargain collectively. All right, the Dust Bowl is the 1930s, so let's not forget this. It has nothing to do with the populace of the 1890s. This is simply when there were very strong winds coupled with a drought that led to these dust storms. Many people in the Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas region were impacted, and the book The Grapes of Wrath is all about a family leaving Oklahoma to go to California. So, who criticized the New Deal? Well, I should put on there that business people criticized the New Deal. Sorry for that. They thought it was too socialistic and was detrimental to the laissez faire philosophy that the U.S. was subscribing to prior to FDR. But then there are some people who thought that the New Deal did not do enough, and that would be Huey Long, who actually wanted it to be even more liberal. Huey Long's program was called Share Our Wealth. He wanted to give every American a car and a house and spending money. And how would he pay for this? With a 100% tax over $1 million. In other words, anything that you made over $1 million would go to the federal government. Supreme Court also did not agree with every part of the New Deal. There are 9 people in the Supreme Court. There are 9 now also, now that Neil Gorsuch has been confirmed. We had 8 for a while. And FDR was frustrated because they were declaring some of the acts unconstitutional. So he decided that he should be able to appoint a new justice for everyone who was over 70 and a half years, I believe. Not sure where he came up with that. And that would give him 6 new appointees for a total of 15. And of course, he would get to pick them. Congress rejected his court packing scheme. So, in conclusion, if the New Deal is something that you believe in, then you are content with FDR's ability to create jobs and develop infrastructure in the country and make people feel comforted during a very difficult time. If you are against the New Deal, you are concerned how the national debt increased and how the role of government was expanded in the economy. And that, I hope I'll be able to figure out how to stop this, is the end of my recording. Best of luck, and I'll talk to you soon.